Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going to tackle this really fascinating set of ideas, all having to do with how advertising has fundamentally changed in the digital age.
Yeah,
And you've given us a really rich collection of materials to go through here.
it is a very long reading list.
It is, and I think our goal here is to kind of pull out the most crucial shifts. There's surprising moments that kind of make you rethink things,
Yeah.
and then those core principles that still matter.
Yes.
And all of this is really tailored for you as someone who wants to kind of understand this stuff without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah. Cut through the noise and try and find what really endures.
Yeah.
And also what's genuinely new
Yeah, I
in the
think
world
so.
of marketing and communication.
Absolutely. And just to kind of get you thinking right off the bat, consider this. In 2013, when Miles Young, then the head of Ogilvy and Mather, decided to gather their digital council, where he did it,
I don't know where.
he didn't pick Silicon Valley, right? You would think that's where all the digital stuff is happening.
Yeah.
But he picked a medieval setting in Tufu in France.
Oh, wow.
So isn't that a deliberate and kind of a really thought-provoking choice?
It is.
It immediately highlights one of these key tensions that I think we'll be exploring throughout this whole deep dive, which is this idea of the enduring need for perspective, right? Like
Yeah.
that connection to something timeless, even amidst the most rapid technological change.
It's really interesting, the juxtaposition of, you know, those minds focused on the cutting edge of digital strategy in a place steeped in, centuries of history.
Yeah.
It forces you to consider what truly changes and what remains fundamentally the same
Yeah.
about human interaction and influence.
Totally. And speaking of things that endure, our first point, I think, takes us straight to a cornerstone of advertising wisdom, which is Ogilvy on advertising.
Yeah.
This book wasn't just some passing trend. It was a massive hit.
Huge.
Like within months of being published, it just went gangbusters.
That's great.
Yeah. And it remains a genuine classic. It's still in print over 3 decades later. It's been translated into countless languages.
Wow, yeah.
And it's even used in university courses around the world. So think about it. For so many people, whether they work in advertising or not, this book is their first and sometimes only real introduction to the Ogilvy agency itself.
Right.
That's staying power.
It really speaks to the power of fundamental insights.
Yeah.
That a book written before the rise of the internet could remain so relevant.
Yeah.
Tells you that, certain core principles about what captures people's attention, what motivates them, haven't vanished.
Yeah.
So, the enduring success of Ogilvy on advertising suggests that even in our hyper-digital world,
Yes.
fundamental truths about human psychology and persuasion
Still matter.
still hold immense power.
Totally.
So don't get so caught up in, the latest algorithm that you forget the core principles
Yeah.
of, crafting a compelling message.
Right. And this isn't just theoretical, right? The staying power. There's a great little story about Miles Young's first encounter with David Ogilvy back in 1982.
Yeah.
Young was a young account director, really excited about a recent win,
Okay.
Guinness business.
Okay.
And he was working late one evening, and Ogilvy just happened to walk by, saw a new face popped into chat,
Yeah.
and Young enthusiastically shared the news about this Guinness win and how great the work was.
Yeah.
And Ogilvy, seemingly out of nowhere, asked, "But are they gentlemen?"
Oh, interesting.
And fast forward, a few months later, and the CEO of Guinness at the time, Ernest Saunders, ends up facing serious legal troubles.
Oh, wow.
So it kind of suggests this uncanny foresight on Ogilvy's part, right?
Yeah.
This focus on core values and character
Yeah.
that went way beyond immediate business success, So it makes you think, in our data-driven world,
Yeah.
are we even considering these more qualitative, character-based aspects of business relationships anymore?
Yeah, it really highlights Ogilvy's understanding that long-term success isn't just about, clever campaigns or innovative technology.
Right.
It's also deeply intertwined with the integrity and character of, the people and organizations involved.
Right.
And in an age where trust is increasingly fragile,
Yeah.
that focus on fundamental values seems more relevant than ever.
Right, and Ogilvy wasn't some starry-eyed optimist,
Right.
blindly embracing every new piece of technology, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
He actually had a pretty strong reaction to a lot of the verbiage, hyper-redundancy, overcomplication, and ungrounded optimism surrounding the digital revolution, even while acknowledging, the incredible possibilities it offered.
Yeah.
So that critical, grounded perspective feels incredibly valuable today as we navigate just this constant flood of digital information.
I wonder, though, if some of that ungrounded optimism that he cautioned against might have actually fueled the innovation and the rapid growth of the digital space.
Right.
Sometimes that initial enthusiasm, even if a bit overblown, can be a really powerful driver.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Maybe there's a balance to be struck between that optimistic drive and a healthy dose of critical evaluation.
Yeah.
And it's almost like history repeating itself, right?
Yeah.
The arrival of digital media and its impact on advertising has some really clear parallels with the introduction of television back in the 1950s.
Right.
Which was another massive disruption. It presented huge challenges, but also brand new opportunities for the established ad men of the time. The Bill Burnbacks, the Rosser Reeveses. These guys had to figure out this whole new medium.
That historical parallel is so important for putting things in perspective. Advertising has always been in a state of flux.
Totally.
Adapting to new technologies, evolving consumer behaviors.
Yeah.
The digital revolution is undoubtedly significant, but is part of a longer pattern of disruption and adaptation.
Totally. And despite all the talk about the death of traditional advertising,
right.
The sources we're looking at here make a really important point, which is sacred advertising tomes like Ogilvy on advertising still do matter. And it's a direct counter to some of the really dismissive attitudes you sometimes hear from the digital native crowd.
It is fascinating to see that recognition that while the tools and channels have multiplied exponentially, the fundamental principles of persuasion and storytelling and deeply understanding your audience haven't suddenly become obsolete.
Right.
These classic texts provide a foundational understanding that remains surprisingly relevant, even if the execution looks very different today.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of established, I think, that some core principles endure.
Yeah.
Let's dive into the evolution of the internet itself.
Okay.
And how its funding models came to be. Because it's easy to forget that the internet didn't just spring into existence as a commercial powerhouse.
Right.
It evolved quite incrementally and after its initial purpose as a defense network, ARPANET.
Right.
It was, in the words of our source, a technology looking for a commercial model.
Right.
Rather than one of commerce seeking a technological solution. Yeah. Which kind of flips the script on how we often think about innovation, doesn't it?
It does. It explains why the early internet felt so open and at times chaotic.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't driven by immediate profit motives in the way many technologies are launched today.
Right.
It was a solution that then had to find its applications, including commercial ones.
Totally. And it's worth remembering some of the key figures who shaped this technology. We were talking about pioneers like Vinton Cerf and Robert Kahn, the folks who got ARPANET up and running and developed TCP/IP.
Yeah.
Those fundamental communication protocols that allow different networks to talk to each other.
Right.
And then you have Bernard Marty, the co-inventor of France's Minitel, which, while less globally widespread, was actually a fascinating precursor to the World Wide Web.
Interesting.
Offering online services years before the internet took off.
Right.
And let's not forget Paul Mockapetris, who co-created the DNS, the domain naming system.
Yeah.
Which is essentially the internet's phone book. Without the domain name system, you would have to remember those complex numerical addresses.
Right.
For every website, So Mockapetris's work essentially made the internet user-friendly, which really paved the way for the mass adoption and the commercialization that advertising now relies on.
Recognizing these individuals and their foundational contributions helps us understand that the internet we know today is built on layers of innovation.
Yeah.
Each building upon the last.
Yeah.
It wasn't a sudden creation, but a gradual evolution driven by these key thinkers.
Totally. Now, here's a crucial bit. There was a significant initial resistance to the idea of funding models on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people almost expected it to be this free open space forever.
Right.
And traditional media companies actually compounded this by giving away their premium content online for absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It's kind of ironic in retrospect, isn't it?
It is. There was a strong prevailing ethos that information online should be freely accessible. And established media outlets struggled to adapt their traditional business models to this new reality.
Yeah.
Inadvertently, they helped to create an expectation of free content that the advertising industry has largely stepped in to fulfill.
Yeah, and guess who largely stepped in to fill that funding void?
The advertising industry.
The advertising industry, yeah.
Yeah.
Our source highlights Google as a prime example. Think about this. Google makes, on average, over $3 in profit every single year from every person
All
on
right.
Earth.
Wow.
If you just count those of us who are actually connected to the internet, that figure jumps to over $7.
Wow.
So that free Google search you just did,
Right.
not so free after all.
This really underscores the symbiotic relationship between the internet's growth and the advertising industry.
Totally.
You know, the vast infrastructure and many of the services we take for granted online are heavily subsidized by advertising revenue.
Yeah.
Nothing online truly comes without a cost. It's just that the payment model has largely shifted away from direct user fees.
Right. And as the internet became more commercial,
Yeah.
it inevitably evolved into a set of highly vested media interests.
Right.
These aren't just governments calling the shots anymore.
Yeah.
It's these powerful commercial entities that have really shaped the digital advertising landscape.
Right.
And understandably, they've often crafted a narrative around digital advertising that supports their own agendas.
Yeah.
Sometimes with these kind of dramatic pronouncements like, old media are irretrievably dead.
This evolution into vested interests is a really critical lens, I think, through which to view the current digital advertising ecosystem.
Yeah.
These powerful players have their own motivations and narratives that significantly influence the flow of information and the direction of the industry.
Totally. Which brings us to, I think, our next point, which is this fascinating concept of the age of.
Okay.
And our source really emphasizes that the digital world isn't so much about this or that anymore.
Right.
It's much more about this and that. They even quote Jim Collins talking about visionary companies embracing both ends of a continuum.
Okay.
Continuity and change. So how does this apply to marketing?
What's really interesting here is the way the lines between traditional marketing disciplines are blurring.
Yeah.
The clear distinctions that once separated advertising, public relations, direct marketing, sales enablement
Yeah.
are becoming much less defined in the digital space.
Yeah. It's not about choosing one over the other.
Right.
It's about recognizing how they now intersect and overlap.
Yeah.
Much of what we now call digital advertising has a significant public relations component to it.
Right.
Managing brand reputation, building relationships online.
Right.
Similarly, a lot of public relations efforts now involve direct marketing tactics.
Yes.
Driving specific actions and conversions. The old silos just aren't as relevant in this interconnected environment.
Precisely. The digital landscape demands a more integrated and holistic approach.
Yeah.
Where these previously distinct functions work together in a much more fluid and collaborative way.
Really?
The age of, and I think really captures this necessary integration and the collapsing of those traditional boundaries.
Now let's talk about digital content.
Okay.
Remember back in the early days when branded content was this relatively new idea?
Yeah.
Our source points to BMW's The Hire. Those short films they produced for the internet and DVD way back in 2001 and 2002 is a really seminal example. They got big-name directors and actors to create these narrative segments that subtly showcase the performance of BMW cars.
Right.
So it was a completely new way for a brand to engage an audience.
The Hire was truly groundbreaking.
Yeah.
It demonstrated the potential for brands to create compelling entertainment that also served a marketing purpose.
Right.
It was a significant departure from traditional advertising, and it really foreshadowed the vast landscape of branded content we see today.
Yeah. And as the internet exploded, the term content kind of became this catch-all, this amorphous word for absolutely anything that lived online.
Right.
From your friend's social media post to a major news website.
Yeah.
And eventually brands realized they couldn't just create random bits of content.
Yeah.
They needed to build entire ecosystems of content.
Right.
Where all the pieces were connected, they served a purpose, and ideally provided some real value to the user.
Yeah, the evolution from isolated content pieces to these interconnected ecosystems
Right.
reflects a more strategic and user-centric approach to digital presence.
Totally.
Brands understood that simply shouting their message wasn't enough.
Yeah.
They needed to create a valuable and engaging experience for their audience across multiple touch points.
Right. And to help us make sense of this vast content landscape,
Right.
our source introduces this idea of a content grid.
Okay.
With two key axes. You've got breadth versus personalization on one side.
Yeah.
And utility versus entertainment on the other.
Yeah.
So it helps you visualize, the different types of content a brand might create. From broad-reaching informational pieces to highly personalized and engaging entertainment.
This content grid provides a really useful framework for thinking strategically about content creation.
Yeah.
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 It forces brands to consider both who they're trying to reach.
Right.
Breadth versus personalization.
Yeah.
And what they want that content to achieve.
Right.
Utility versus entertainment.
Right now, storytelling.
Yeah.
The marketing buzzword that everyone loves.
Right.
And our source agrees it's absolutely crucial in the digital age.
Yeah.
But they caution against getting too formulaic about it
Right.
or misinterpreting the role of the storyteller.
Yeah.
They even make this fantastic analogy. They compare a marketer to a roller coaster designer,
Oh, interesting.
someone who crafts an entire experience,
Yeah.
not just recites a narrative.
That's a brilliant analogy.
Right.
It highlights the need for marketers to think beyond just telling a story.
Right.
And focus on creating an immersive and engaging experience for the audience, complete with emotional ups and downs.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
It's about designing a journey, not just delivering a monologue.
And in the midst of all this complexity and talk of intricate strategies,
Right.
there's this refreshing call for simplicity as a key to creativity.
Oh, yeah.
You know, our source references Neil French's How to Carve an Elephant.
Yeah.
This idea that the most powerful and memorable ideas are often the most elegantly simple.
That emphasis on simplicity is so vital in our cluttered digital world. You know,
Yeah.
clear, concise messaging that cuts through the noise is often the most effective.
Right.
It's about distilling the essence of an idea down to its most impactful form.
Okay, now let's delve into why some content just seems to explode and get shared like crazy online. Our source dives into the science behind sharing, focusing on this concept of high arousal,
Yeah.
often positive emotions,
Yeah.
and its disinhibitory and reminiscence effects.
Right.
Basically, highly emotional content makes us more likely to share it
Yeah.
and easier to remember it later.
What's particularly insightful here is the strong connection between emotional response and the propensity to share.
Totally.
You know, content that evokes strong feelings, especially positive ones, tends to be much more contagious in the digital sphere.
Right.
And the reminiscence effect means that this type of content also has a longer lasting impact on memory.
Right. But here's the real kicker. The key emotional driver of sharing, according to research by McDonnell and Ewing, turned out to be a surprise.
Interesting.
It's that unexpected element, that novelty, that really grabs our attention and makes us want to pass it on to others.
That element of surprise is absolutely crucial in breaking through the constant barrage of information we face online.
Right.
You know, something unexpected and novel has a much higher chance of capturing attention
Right.
and prompting people to share it with their network.
Think about hugely successful campaigns like Share a Coke.
Yeah.
You know, it was such a simple idea, just putting people's names on Coke bottles.
Yeah.
But it generated billions of shares.
That's amazing.
It personalized a massive, iconic brand in
Yeah.
a surprising and delightful way, and people absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Share a Coke perfectly illustrates the power of surprise, combined with personalization and a sense of connection.
Yeah.
You know, it tapped into people's desire for self-expression and sharing in a simple yet incredibly effective way, leading to massive organic reach.
And this leads us to this idea that brands have not just big ideas in their advertising campaigns,
Right.
but also big ideals with a trademark.
Okay.
These are their fundamental cultural points of view,
Yeah.
their core beliefs about the world that go beyond just selling products and aim to influence society in a positive way.
The concept of big ideals represents a really interesting evolution in branding. You know,
Yeah.
it moves beyond just functional benefits and emotional appeals
Right.
to a deeper level of purpose,
Right.
where brands articulate a clear and compelling worldview
Right.
that resonates with consumers on a more profound level.
Yeah, a prime example they give is Dove believes the world would be a better place if women were allowed to feel good about themselves.
Oh, wow.
That's a powerful organizing principle.
Yeah.
You know, that informs pretty much everything the brand does, from its advertising to its social initiatives.
Right.
It's a move from simply focusing on share of market to striving for share of culture,
Yeah.
with brands essentially aiming to start a movement around their core belief.
This shift towards share of culture reflects the growing expectation for brands to have a positive impact that extends beyond their product offerings.
Yeah.
You know, consumers are increasingly drawn to brands that align with their own values
Right.
and contribute to broader cultural conversations.
But with this increased focus on brand belief and purpose
Right.
comes huge pressure for transparency in the digital age.
Yes.
There's really nowhere to hide anymore. You know,
Yeah.
authenticity is absolutely key. And when brands fail to live up to their stated promises,
Yeah.
they face the consequences very quickly. You know, Chipotle struggles after their food safety scandals,
Right.
despite their food with integrity promise,
Yeah.
serves as a really stark reminder of that.
Yeah. The digital age has significantly amplified scrutiny on brands.
Yeah.
Any disconnect between a brand's stated values and its actual practices
Right.
can be rapidly exposed and widely publicized,
Right.
leading to significant reputational damage.
Yeah.
Authenticity is no longer a marketing buzzword. It's a fundamental requirement
Right.
for building and maintaining trust.
And the power of belief is actually backed up by research.
Oh, okay.
Ogilvy and Mather conducted a study that showed brands with a stronger, more clearly articulated point of view actually had higher consumer consideration and a greater likelihood of future market share growth.
Interesting.
So it really does seem to pay for a brand to stand for something meaningful.
That research underscores the tangible business benefits of having a clear and compelling brand belief.
Right.
Consumers are more likely to connect with and remain loyal to brands that have a distinct perspective.
Yeah.
And stand for something beyond just their products or services.
Now, moving beyond just having a belief,
Yeah.
our sources argue that consumers increasingly need brands to matter.
Okay.
It's not enough to have a cool logo or an emotionally resonant ad campaign.
Right.
People want to see brands taking real action and connecting with the cultural values they care about.
The concept of mattering elevates the role of brands in society. Consumers are looking for more than just products or services.
Right.
They want brands to demonstrate relevance
Right.
and make a positive contribution to their lives and the world around them.
We see examples of this with Philips' Breathless Choir campaign, which highlighted how their healthcare technology helps people with respiratory illnesses live fuller lives, or Always Like a Girl campaign, which tapped into this powerful message of female empowerment and challenged limiting stereotypes.
These campaigns demonstrate how brands can forge deeper connections with consumers by addressing real-world issues and showcasing their positive impact in authentic and meaningful ways.
Totally. And a crucial aspect of mattering is diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
Our source points out the continued underrepresentation of women in leadership positions and in STEM fields.
Right.
And how this can impact the way advertising is created and perceived.
Yeah.
They highlight examples of brands actively embracing the mainstreaming of marginalized groups.
Yeah.
Like Tiffany & Co. featuring a gay couple in their advertising, which was quite groundbreaking at the time.
Right.
Or the launch of initiatives like Ogilvy Pride and Ogilvy Noor.
Right.
Specifically focusing on engaging with the LGBTQ plus and Muslim communities, respectively.
Yeah, this growing emphasis on diversity and inclusion reflects a broader societal shift and the increasing recognition that brands have a responsibility to be representative and respectful of all segments of the population. Mainstreaming marginalized groups is not only socially responsible, but also makes good business sense by allowing brands to connect with a wider range of consumers in authentic ways.
Let's shift gears now and talk about data.
Okay.
David Ogilvy himself appreciated the power of direct response and data.
Right.
But our source cautions against the idea that data alone is the ultimate solution.
Yeah.
As they put it quite plainly, just because you can collect data doesn't mean you should.
That's a really critical point.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of data available in the digital age can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that more data automatically leads to better insights.
Yeah.
It's crucial to be selective and focus on data that is truly relevant to the specific problems you're trying to solve.
Right. Instead, they introduce this concept of really useful data resolution.
Okay.
Emphasizing that you need to start with the specific business problem or question you're trying to answer.
Right.
Not just wade aimlessly through endless data sets. It's about combining a broad understanding of the overall business landscape with the ability to zoom in with precision on what the data can actually tell you about that specific problem.
Yeah, the focus on really useful data resolution highlights the importance of having a strategic and problem-oriented approach to data.
Yeah.
It's about using data as a tool to answer specific questions.
Right.
And drive meaningful insights that lead to effective action.
Yeah.
Rather than just collecting and reporting on metrics in isolation.
Right. They even outline 7 prerequisites for really useful data.
Right.
Things like having a single unified view of the customer across the entire enterprise.
Yeah.
Focusing on actual customer outcomes rather than just internal metrics.
Right.
And even rediscovering the value of more traditional analytical techniques like econometric modeling in combination with digital data.
These prerequisites provide a really valuable roadmap for ensuring that data collection and analysis are purposeful.
Yeah.
And contribute to more effective marketing strategies. They underscored the need for integration across different parts of the business, a customer-centric focus, and a balanced approach to analytics.
Right. And they draw a really interesting distinction between measurement cultures and effectiveness cultures.
Okay.
They use this great analogy with a high-tech tennis racket
Okay.
that meticulously measures every aspect of your swing,
Yeah.
but doesn't necessarily make you a better tennis player.
Right.
It's a powerful reminder that just because you can measure something doesn't automatically mean it's driving actual effectiveness or better results.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the danger of becoming too fixated on metrics without understanding their correlation to real business outcomes.
Totally.
A true effectiveness culture prioritizes achieving tangible results over simply tracking and reporting on activity.
And this leads to, I think, a really important warning about over-relying on short-term digital metrics like clicks and impressions
Right.
at the expense of long-term brand building.
Yeah.
Referencing the significant research of Binet and Field. It's easy to get caught up in the immediate feedback loops of digital campaigns,
Yeah.
but that can be really detrimental to building lasting brand equity and sustainable growth.
Right. Binet and Field's extensive research consistently demonstrates that a balanced approach,
Yeah.
combining short-term sales activation with long-term brand building efforts,
Right.
is the most effective strategy for sustainable growth.
Yeah.
An overemphasis on short-term digital metrics can lead to a neglect of the more foundational aspects of brand development that drive long-term success.
Now let's talk about intent.
Okay.
Our source introduces John Battel's idea of the database of intentions.
Yeah.
Positions keywords as the fundamental common denominators of the digital age.
Right.
When someone actively searches for something online, that keyword provides a really powerful insight into their current needs, desires, problems they're trying to solve.
Yeah. Battel's concept really highlights the profound power of search data in understanding consumer intent in a way that was never before possible. Keywords provide a direct and unfiltered window into what people are actively seeking,
Right.
offering incredibly valuable opportunities for marketers to connect with them at precisely the right moment.
And the key to effectively connecting that expressed intent with relevant content.
Yeah.
And ultimately connecting marketers with consumers is this elusive concept of intimacy.
Yeah.
But achieving genuine intimacy at scale in the vast and often impersonal digital world is an incredibly difficult challenge.
The idea of intimacy at scale really captures the holy grail of digital marketing.
Yeah.
Creating personalized and meaningful connections with a large audience.
Right.
However, the inherent challenges of automation, data privacy concerns, and the sheer volume of online interactions make this a complex and ongoing endeavor.
Right. This brings us to the rise of programmatic media trading,
Yeah.
where sophisticated algorithms automate the buying and selling of ad space in real time while it offers significant efficiency and scale. There's a real risk of losing that human touch, that genuine understanding of the individual consumer behind the anonymized data point.
Yeah. Programmatic buying offers tremendous efficiencies in reaching vast audiences. But it's crucial to remember that technology is just a tool.
Totally.
A purely automated approach without a deep understanding of consumer context and intent risks undermining the very goal of creating meaningful and relevant connections.
Right. Our next deep dive is into creative technology, which our source aptly calls the sweet spot.
Okay.
That transformative convergence of creativity and technology in marketing.
Right.
It's about moving beyond the traditional divide between the artists and the geeks in an agency.
Yeah, this convergence is indeed where a lot of the most exciting and innovative work in marketing is happening right now.
Totally.
It's about leveraging technology, not just for efficiency and reach,
Yeah.
but as a fundamental canvas for new forms of creative expression and audience engagement.
Totally. And at the forefront of this is UX, or user experience.
Yeah.
Originally conceived by Don Norman as human-centered design,
Yeah.
it's now this broad and fiercely debated domain that encompasses pretty much everything related to how a user interacts with a digital product or service.
Right.
From information architecture and user research to content strategy, psychology, visual design.
Yeah, UX has evolved into a critical discipline that focuses on creating seamless, intuitive, and enjoyable interactions for users.
Totally.
It's about deeply understanding the user's needs, behaviors, and motivations,
Yeah.
and designing digital experiences that are both effective and satisfying.
So a good UX designer today needs a surprisingly broad and diverse skill set,
Right.
ranging from copywriting and information architecture to an understanding of sound motion graphic design,
Wow.
and even a working knowledge of basic coding principles.
Yeah.
It's a real jack of all digital trades role.
The breadth of skills required really reflects the holistic nature of user experience design.
Totally.
It's not just about aesthetics or technical functionality.
Right.
It's about creating a cohesive and positive experience across all touch points of a user's journey.
Right. And our source uses Uber as a prime example of excellent UX in action.
Oh, okay.
The magic isn't just the visually appealing app. It's the entire seamless experience,
Yeah.
from clearly showing fare estimates and real-time driver locations
Right.
to the efficient redistribution of drivers based on demand.
Right.
It fundamentally transformed a previously often frustrating experience, hailing a taxi,
Yeah.
into something almost entirely frictionless.
Yeah, Uber's success is a powerful testament to the impact of user-centered design.
Yeah.
By focusing relentlessly on the entire customer journey and eliminating pain points,
Yeah.
they created a differentiated and highly valued experience
Yeah.
that disrupted an entire industry.